There was a time when the world believed Japan would own the future. Imagine the neon glow of Tokyo in the 1980s, the streets alive with businessmen in dark suits rushing between meetings, the stock exchange buzzing with energy, Sony billboards lighting up the skyline, and the hum of a nation that seemed unstoppable. Headlines across the globe predicted that Japan would soon overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Books like Japan as #1 captured the mood of the era, and American policymakers worried that their industries would be swallowed by Japanese corporations. The fear was not unfounded. Japanese firms were buying up iconic landmarks like Rockefeller Center and Hollywood studios, a symbolic gesture that suggested the rising sun was casting its light across the entire world. Yet today, those same streets tell a different story. Wages have stagnated, shops have shuttered, and the population is aging at a pace unmatched by any other developed nation. The once unstoppable miracle economy now struggles with 3 decades of stagnation. How did this happen? How did the nation that terrified Washington and inspired the world end up stuck in a cycle of economic malaise? The answer lies not in a single event, but in a convergence of forces. The bursting of an unprecedented asset bubble, policy missteps that compounded the crisis, demographic decline, cultural rigidity, and global shifts that left Japan behind. To understand Japan's journey from superpower to stagnation, we must retrace the arc of its rise, its fall, and the lessons it offers for the future. Japan's post-war rise was nothing short of miraculous. In 1945, the country lay in ruins, its cities bombed, its economy shattered, and its people struggling to survive. Yet within a generation, Japan transformed itself into an industrial powerhouse. With U.S. aid and reforms that reshaped its institutions, Japan rebuilt its infrastructure, modernized its industries, and embraced a model of growth that prioritized exports. By the 1950s and 1960s, Japanese companies were flooding global markets with affordable, reliable products. Cars from Toyota and Honda, electronics from Sony and Panasonic, and semiconductors from NEC became household names. The Japanese miracle was not just about numbers, it was about a society that believed in discipline, hard work, and collective progress. Factories operated with precision, workers dedicated themselves to lifetime employment, and the government coordinated industrial policy with remarkable efficiency. By the 1980s, Japan's GDP growth was the envy of the world, and its corporations were seen as unstoppable juggernauts. The global perception of Japan during this era was one of awe and fear. American industries, particularly in automobiles and semiconductors, felt the pressure of Japanese competition. Trade tensions flared, and politicians warned of a future where Japan would dominate global markets. The purchase of American landmarks by Japanese firms symbolized this anxiety, as if the rising sun was eclipsing the stars and stripes. Yet beneath the glittering surface of prosperity, cracks were forming. The very policies and cultural practices that had fueled Japan's rise were sowing the seeds of stagnation. The thesis of this story is clear. Japan's decline was not the result of a single misfortune, but of a complex interplay of economic bubbles, policy failures, demographic challenges, and cultural rigidity. To understand why Japan went from superpower to stagnation, we must peel back each layer of this history. The first chapter of this decline begins with the bubble economy of the 1980s. Fueled by easy credit and speculative frenzy, asset prices in Japan soared to unimaginable heights. Real estate and stock markets skyrocketed, creating an illusion of endless growth. By 1989, the value of land in Tokyo was said to exceed that of the entire state of California. Companies borrowed heavily, banks lent recklessly, and investors poured money into assets that seemed destined to rise forever. The atmosphere was one of euphoria, a belief that Japan had discovered a formula for perpetual prosperity. Yet bubbles, by their nature, are unsustainable. The illusion of endless growth masked the fragility of the system, and when the bubble burst, the consequences were devastating. The crash of the early 1990s ushered in what became known as the lost decade. In 1991, the bubble burst, and banks were left saddled with bad loans. The stock market collapsed, property values plummeted, and the wealth that had seemed so secure evaporated almost overnight. Families who had invested in real estate saw their savings vanish, corporations faced mounting debt, and the financial system teetered on the brink. The government's response was slow, cautious, and incremental. Rather than aggressively cleaning up the banking sector, policymakers allowed zombie companies to survive, kept alive by banks that were themselves too weak to admit failure. The result was a prolonged stagnation, a decade where growth faltered, confidence eroded, and Japan's economic miracles seemed to fade into memory. The lost decade was not just an economic crisis, it was a psychological one. A nation that had believed in its unstoppable rise now faced the reality of decline. Policy missteps compounded the crisis. Rather than confronting the bad debt head-on, Japan relied on fiscal stimulus without structural reform. The government poured money into public works projects, building roads and bridges, but failed to address the underlying weaknesses of the financial system. Deflation set in, creating a vicious cycle where falling prices discouraged spending and investment. Consumers held back, waiting for prices to drop further, while businesses hesitated to expand. The spiral of deflation deepened the stagnation, making recovery even harder. In contrast, when the United States faced its own financial crisis in 2008, it moved quickly to recapitalize banks and restore confidence. Japan's reluctance to take bold action in the 1990s left it trapped in a cycle of half measures and prolonged malaise. The lesson was clear: delay and caution can be as dangerous as recklessness. When confronting a crisis, beyond policy, Japan faced a demographic time bomb. The nation's population began to age rapidly, with birth rates declining and life expectancy rising. The shrinking workforce meant lower productivity, fewer consumers, and greater strain on social systems. Cultural resistance to immigration compounded the problem, as Japan remained reluctant to open its doors to foreign workers. Rural areas depopulated, pensions strained under the weight of an aging population, and the social fabric began to fray. The demographic decline was not just an economic issue, it was a cultural one. A society built on stability and tradition struggled to adapt to the realities of a shrinking, aging population. The consequences were profound: fewer workers to drive innovation, fewer consumers to sustain demand, and a growing burden on younger generations. Structural and cultural factors further entrenched stagnation. The lifetime employment system, once a source of stability, became a barrier to flexibility. Workers were tied to companies for life, limiting mobility and innovation. Corporate conservatism fostered risk aversion, slowing the pace of change. Bureaucratic inertia made reform difficult, as institutions resisted disruption. In contrast, South Korea and China embraced dynamism, adapting quickly to global shifts and fostering new industries. Japan's rigidity left it behind, unable to seize opportunities in emerging sectors. The very strengths that had fueled its rise, discipline, stability, and collective harmony, became weaknesses in an era that demanded adaptability and risk-taking. Global shifts compounded Japan's challenges. The rise of China as a manufacturing powerhouse reshaped global trade, undercutting Japan's dominance in industries it once controlled. The U.S. tech boom overshadowed Japan's electronics, as Silicon Valley companies like Apple and Microsoft defined the digital era. Japan failed to dominate software and the internet, sectors that became the engines of global growth. Trade liberalization reduced Japan's edge, as competition intensified and its advantages eroded. The world moved on, and Japan struggled to keep pace. Its corporations remained strong in certain areas, but the aura of unstoppable dominance was gone. The rising sun had dimmed, overshadowed by new powers and new technologies. Yet Japan's story is not one of collapse. Despite stagnation, Japan remains wealthy, stable, and technologically advanced. Its cities are modern, its infrastructure world-class, and its society safe and orderly. But the aura of superpower status has faded. Japan avoided disaster, but it lost its place at the forefront of global economic power. The lessons of its journey are clear. Bubbles must be confronted, demographics cannot be ignored, and reform must be embraced with urgency. Japan's experience is a cautionary tale for all nations, a reminder that no growth miracle lasts forever. Economic power depends not on past success, but on adaptability to future challenges. As the story closes, we return to the images of the 1980s. Tokyo's neon lights, the bustling stock exchange, the headlines predicting Japan's dominance. Japan was once the future, a nation that seemed destined to lead the world. Today, its quiet stagnation tells a different story. The broader reflection is sobering. Japan's rise and fall remind us that even superpowers can stumble. The real challenge is not rising but staying on top. Economic power is fleeting, and the forces of change are relentless. Japan's journey from superpower to stagnation is a lesson for all nations. Adaptability, reform, and resilience are the keys to enduring prosperity. And so the final line resonates with truth. Japan reminds us that even superpowers can stumble. And the real challenge is not rising, but staying on top.